Hello, Laurie. Good to see you. Thank you for joining me.
I am. Good to see you too.
So let's start then by getting to know you a little bit. Tell us about your journey into Quakers and how long ago that was. And I'm interested in what were you seeking and what did you find?
It's hard to know where to start exactly, but I first attended meeting in 1987 when I was 25. Um, I'd I grew up and was brought up as a Jew, um, and I was bar mitzvah, and in my teens, I suppose I first of all, I guess I probably had a bit of deep exploration of being Jewish, and then I decided I was an atheist. Late teens, my mum got involved in a New Age organization,
Mm.
and I got involved a bit for a couple of years, just when I was 18, 19. Um, and I think that was probably the kind of opening up for me of exploring psychology and spirituality.
Mm.
Um, and but it was a bit, well, I'm kind of, I guess, culty as a shorthand, but
Mm.
um, yeah. Um, and then I suppose by my early, by the time I was 21, 22, I was beginning to think quite a lot about spirituality and exploring Buddhism and, different kind of Eastern traditions and so on. And I can't remember where it was somewhere. I don't know if it's Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy or I can't find it in there, but it's somewhere somebody described Quakers as being the closest Western religion had to Zen. And I was kind of quite interested in that as essentially as um,
Mm.
a spiritual practice without a lot of baggage, in a way. Um, and I came across Quakers. I'm not sure quite what order they came in, but I met. I went to the Other Economics Summit, which was a part of the early new economics movement in the early 80s, and Paul Ekins was involved in that before he was a Quaker, and Pat Saunders, who worked at QSRE, was involved because they were funding it, and so I met a young Quaker who had a "Hug Me" T-shirt on. It was this kind of very this sense of Quakers as nice people, and as
Yeah.
being involved in right on things.
Mm.
Um, and I went and met Pat Saunders because there was a booklet. There was a group or a committee on sharing world resources that I think she must have been the secretary, but went and talked to her about that. So there was stuff around. And then I was living in Brighton and involved in the Oxfam Hungry for Change group there, which was kind of Oxfam sort of education campaigning work. And one of the local people was a Quaker, and there was a few people that I was coming across. So it was kind of those. Oh, and by the way, yeah, so there was a Jewish Quaker there, and there was also a Quaker there who described themselves as being a perennial philosopher. So there were lots of sort of connections for me that
Yeah.
made it feel like, okay, this might be. And I think for me, I'd been trying lots of different things, but they all felt like they were too heavy with other people's cultures or gods or expectations, and I think that just that kind of the simplicity of Quaker worship really,
Mm.
well, I would have been
Mm.
uncomfortable calling it worship then, were, you know,
Yeah.
felt right for me.
That's so
And then
interesting.
talking about, finding my way to Quaker. I mean, I think there were lots of stages of finding my way, and, which could lead up at least to doing equipping for ministry sort of 20 years ago, and, kind of doing Quaker community, the band for Quaker community and stuff like that. All of those
So
sort of.
tell me about your early memories of Quaker meeting then. What did you like about it once you found it?
So this is Brighton. I think it's okay to say it was Brighton. Um, it felt quite austere, which probably, I mean, I doubt if Brighton meeting feels austere. I haven't been there for a while, but these days, but it was a bit of, quite a strong sense of this tradition and, the kind of learning the rules by osmosis and
Mm,
that kind of stuff. Um, I remember really taking it as a sort of meditation mindfulness practice and being a bit irritated when people spoke. Um, and and being encouraged to go and go and attend. I'm not sure if it was YFGM then. It was probably Young Friends Central Committee or whatever it was called then. And not feeling like I wanted to be a young Quaker, feeling like I wanted to be in the proper meeting,
yeah.
and that's how it felt. And uh, yeah, but I think I mean maybe other bits I should say about myself. I'm probably somewhat neurodivergent. I'm not very good with group stuff and social stuff.
Mm,
And so, so I tended to run away at coffee time and,
yeah, yeah,
so I went for meeting for worship. Yeah.
yeah. So there's a lot in there that I want to ask more about.
Mhm.
So I suppose I'm interested in a few things about you said that you were atheist at one point. How would you describe where you're at the moment?
I think in convention, in the Richard Dawkins sense, I think I'm still an atheist. I'm definitely I do not believe in a personal creator God that directs the universe. I have no experience that I feel the need to call God.
Hmm.
I'm happy to use God language,
Right.
but I'm not sure that it means the same for me that it means. I'm thinking it probably doesn't, or for most people. But
Yeah.
um, and maybe a bit of where I say I'm somewhat neurodiverse. An element of that is I don't really have a sensory imagination, so
Interesting.
I don't hear voices or see images or anything like that.
Hmm.
So I mean, I've found some of the thinking about spirituality and, for example, the four spiritualities. I don't know if you know that
No.
stuff that sort of comes out of it's a sort of Myers-Briggs influence thing, but
Okay.
it's the idea that there's the path of unity, the path of harmony. So unity is the kind of it's a Zen really or a Buddhist non-duality experience of non-dualism, non-duality. Harmony is more Christian, the sort of
Right.
love. God is love, if you like.
Hmm.
There's the path of works, which is the sort of Catholic, devotional. No, sorry, it's the Catholic and maybe Protestant actually works in the world type stuff, and then there's the path of devotion, which is rituals. So I think there's something for me that's I just say that because I'm really interested in our diverse spiritualities and how we hold them together. And I suppose for me, that really for me is fundamentally important in Quakerism that we have a practice that can do that.
Yes, it can absorb us all, can't it? Yeah. But while you were talking then, you said that you don't have a sensory imagination. I think you put it. I'm so intrigued by that. And I mean, I don't know much about that. So I'm just wondering, if you don't mind me asking, does that mean that you never get distracted in a meeting for worship?
Oh
Or,
no, no. I mean, I have thoughts in my head. So I mean, I have thoughts. Sometimes I'm, some of the time in meeting for worship, I'm being very intentional and focused and,
yeah.
and sometimes I'm following a line of thought. And, I do have an imagination, but I don't see things or hear things or.
Yeah, I'm
you
just
know.
trying. You've made me wonder whether I see things or hear things. And I would say that it's really interesting, isn't it, once you try to think about what happens. I mean, when I'm really deeply centered in a meeting, um, there's some deep focus that happens, is the best I can describe it. It's not like somebody speaks to me or that I see anything. Um, but there's some deep focus where I gradually become aware of an idea or a concept or a thought. And you wouldn't put it in those terms. It's just, as you say, God is love or something slowly just comes into focus almost. So I wouldn't say that it's a vision or a hearing of anything, but I haven't really thought about it until you said that.
Mm.
Can I ask you then something else you said at the beginning, which is about you grew up as a Jew and
Mm.
you've obviously moved away from that. What are you left with? One of the things that I'm interested in is our spiritual formation and how our early experiences are still with us and they have guided and shaped us in some ways. And
Mm.
I'm just wondering if you look back on that, is there something about the Jewish tradition or family or some aspect of you that finds that still a rich tradition for you?
Um, well, I would still say I'm a Jew. I do still say I'm a Jew.
Okay.
Um, and Judaism is a culture and it's a family, a clade, or I don't know, I
Yeah.
don't know if it's a clade, but it's a tribe, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Um, and that's one of the things where equipping for ministry was really helpful, actually. I mean, I didn't say this about my journey in, but I mean, part of it was spending time in Israel, Palestine in 1987, trying to understand what was going on there.
Right.
And I think coming to the conclusion that actually my the Israelis I was meeting and my family members there inhabited a reality that wasn't mine, and it had a lot to do with. Um, I mean, I guess I basically felt there was not a way of. It felt to me like that is an insoluble problem, starting from where it is, because of the way the intensity of the alternative reality the
Mm.
different reality that people live in. And by the way, I mean part of the background for me too is I didn't say this, but I mean my grandparents were pillars of the Zionist movement, and so there's a lot for me of trying to make sense of that and how I'm an inheritor of that. And I came across Quakers in East Jerusalem. I mean, it was the AFSC. I mean, it's basically legal support office for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. So again, there was a little bit for me there of Quakers
Yeah.
doing useful work in that space. So there's a bit there of, how am I holding that uh, darkness actually, which I've been mulling a lot this week because my birthday is on the 27th of January, which they've, later on got determined as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So, so my birthday tends to be a mulling that stuff kind
Gosh.
of day. But sorry, that's long-winded, but I mean, I think there's a lot of wonderful stuff in Judaism, and it was actually doing equipping for ministry, and particularly Marion McNaughton as a tutor at Woodbrook at that time. That helped me connect a lot more with, I guess, juicy Judaism. I'd grown up in a very sterile Judaism,
Right.
and it was, so that was helpful and kind of getting more engaged with different Jewish spiritualities. And I'm also and kind of recognizing how Judaism's played through into the light and darkness in the world now. And,
Yeah, yeah,
Jesus was a Jew, and, I think Isaiah has had a lot of influence. And so I'm really interested in how those sort of prophetic voices have played
yeah,
through in the world. And
yeah.
also, kind of modern psychoanalysis and so on is a Jewish product, and it's all that
I
stuff.
see. Of course, yeah, of course. So tell me about the equipping for ministry then. You say it had a powerful impact for you, really, helping you think through various
Yeah,
issues.
I mean, it was at I think a lot of people do EFM or used to do EFM at a turning point in their lives.
Mm, mm.
And I was just at the point of probably wanting to, yeah, I was thinking, I'd attended the early meeting for the first time. I was really, so I've worked all my adult life on energy and climate and kind of related, sustainability related stuff. Um, and I was just at a point, I was 40 and feeling ready to drop out of doing my mainstream work and focus. Or I was thinking Quakers had something to bring to this. So that was one bit of it. And I was also thinking that I needed to be more embedded in community. So there was a thing about how I'm embedded in Quakerism as community. Um, Yeah, and so I did equipping for ministry, 2001 to two. It felt like a very long time. It was 2001 to four, so it was quite a long. It's partly just the way the timings of the various things worked, but and I think it was quite a big support through a transformational time in my life, which might have been midlife crisis. People talk about second journey. There's
Yeah.
different ways of talking about, and a big question for me was around discernment. I think that was a big. So I did all of Marion McNaughton's courses on discernment, for instance. That was quite big, and partly because I'd got married for the second time in a Quaker meeting, and it had not felt like the right thing, and I was trying to make sense of how how we had come to do that, and what. And at the end of equipping for ministry, I dropped out of my job, and I was getting divorced, and also I'd started Living Witness, which, you know, so basically trying to focus on approaching Earth crisis stuff with a Quaker, well, how we do it as Quakers.
Mm, mm. Well, before we get into that, because I'd like to know a lot more about that. Um, it's interesting that you mentioned a kind of like a kind of midlife crisis because I've spoken to someone else who we talked about that, and we thought, we kind of laughed a bit. It's like, yes, some people go and buy a sports car, and there's those of us who turn to Quakers and find a complete shift of pace or shift of focus, and as you say, it's kind of a, a kind of a transformational experience. Um, so it's a strange. I haven't really heard people talk about it like that before. It sounds a bit facetious, doesn't it? Um, but it does feel like a real upturning of your life when you suddenly realize that there's a community who are taking this stuff quite seriously.
Yeah,
Um,
but remember, already been a Quaker. I'd been a member since 1988. So this is 13, 14 years after I had
right.
joined Quakers. It was a decision to make that my focus. It was partly that I felt like I'd earned enough money and I
Okay.
didn't feel like that was a high priority.
Right.
Um, but it was also, there was lots of stuff that was, and it was also a feeling that the mainstream was not able to cope with. And I think the way I would put it most simply is
Mm.
the problem of finding a way forward together with climate change and other kind of
Yeah,
existential problems that humanity faces. And I was really wondering, the question for me was, is particularly Quaker, the way Quakerism holds the individual and the collective experience, spiritual experience, is that actually something that might help, where what is required of us is a personal and collective transformation?
I see. With relation to the climate crisis you're talking
Yeah,
about.
I mean, I guess I'd always seen it as both as, there's a sort of mundane, if you like, in the literal sense of worldly, mundane as worldly challenge that requires us to transform if we're going to survive.
Mm.
But then I think there's also a spiritual consciousness thing for me that I suppose I had always grown, I had always felt, some of it is probably my neurodivergence that I'm not comfortable in normal society, that
Mm.
it, and in the normal way that people interact and so on. But I think there is a desire for a deepened, broadened consciousness. So for me, there was always a spiritual. I think the previous 20 years, I probably had separate threads of sustainability work and consciousness, spirituality sort of practice or trying to find a way with that. And I
Mm.
think it was bringing those two threads together.
Yeah. So before we talk about that then, what is the spiritual practice that you're left with now? Before we talk about the climate change, and maybe you can't take them apart anymore, perhaps, I don't know, but what is you've talked about Richard Dawkins, um, but you've also talked about the way in which a Quaker meeting holds individual spirituality as well as the collective. So what is your spiritual practice now?
Well, I suppose I think spiritual practice really needs to permeate. Well, I don't know about needs to, but I suppose the effort is to have it permeate everything really.
Mm, mm,
But in specifically, I mean, I think for me, it's important I have a couple of times of just personal spiritual. I mean, just sitting really every day, which is sort of mindfulness. But I also use the I Ching. I find that really helpful. And I kind of see it as a random voice of, oh, let's look at things this way. And often it's incredibly apt. And it tends to encourage me to be accepting and not to feel like I need to make things happen and stuff like that. But then, I attend at least 4 meetings for worship of different forms a week.
do you?
And,
So
you
that's
know, I mean,
online as well, then, is it?
yeah, so I'm in Oxford, which is a vibrant, big meeting with at least half a dozen meetings for worship a week. And my main, we have two on a Sunday. We have breakfast meetings Tuesday and Thursday. We have a lunchtime meeting on Wednesday, and then young adult friends have one on Monday evening. So and then a lot of those also have Zoom. And then Living Witness currently has 3 meetings for worship a week online. And that's pretty, so particularly the early morning ones are very powerful for me. And yeah, and on the Friday, we have a bit of prepared ministry normally,
Mm.
if somebody offers, and there's afterwards. I mean, I think one of the things with all of these, particularly the breakfast meetings and the Living Witness ones, is that it's a half-hour meeting for worship followed by afterwards or in the breakfast meetings. I've stopped going to breakfast now, but it used to be my most important. The midweek breakfast meetings used to be my most important, and that's partly because of the kind of conversations that happen over breakfast after meeting for worship.
Yeah. Gosh, that is more meeting for worship than most people manage to fit in. Although, like I say, there's been such a lot of growth in the online meetings available now that it's available to more and more people. Um, so this Living Witness project, then, I don't know much about it. So why don't you tell me what that's all about and your role in that?
Um, well, originally, so I had been researching sustainable living, sustainable consumption in Oxford. Um, and, really what shapes people's lifestyles and so on. Um, and I had been doing it partly because of thinking it was the bit people don't want to look at in the kind of sustainability agenda, whatever you want to call it. And and I was finding it hard to see how, and at the time, I think the new Labour government, when they came in, actually quite had quite a strong program around sustainable
Right.
consumption and communities, and it got dropped. Um, it was just really obvious people weren't willing to really look at the question of, do we need to consume less or do we need to live more simply, and what does that look like? And so sorry, I'm just making this too long-winded probably, but yearly meeting in 2001 had on the agenda really the question, have we got a testimony to the earth?
Right.
Um, and it was we had it was quite a big, it was a residential yearly meeting and it was quite a big bit of the agenda. Um, and we came out, Helen Stephen wrote this call to action, which we adopted. Um, so there was a lot of powerful feeling and intention and
Mm.
whatever, but not a clear sense of what we were going to do. And there was a yearly meeting minute looking forward to hearing what local meetings were doing.
Right.
And I felt that needed a bit of help. So originally it was kind of partly responding to that. And it was saying, actually, oh, and by the way, I spoke in one of the sessions and somebody from JRCT came up to me afterwards and said, we've got money if you want to do something about that. So that's kind of where it came from originally. And I was I was really interested, I think because of researching sustainable living, I was really conscious of how important community is around
Mm.
and who people identify with and how people identify is around how they behave. And I was seeing our kind of collective reflexivity, our collective willingness to re-examine how our faith translates into practice,
Mm.
which comes out through the revisions of the Book of Discipline, and but also some of the ways that we adopt practices maybe a bit ahead of the zeitgeist.
Mm.
I mean, it's hard to know sometimes whether we're being just in tune with the leading edge of the zeitgeist or whether we're leading it.
Mm.
But yeah, so I was.
So what are the important aspects of community then in terms of sustainability? Could you spell that out?
Hmm. Oh, sorry. And you asked what living witness was. I mean, I maybe should say a couple more words about what living witness became,
Okay.
because what I did was ask. I tried to find out which meetings had done something collectively about sustainability. And I asked those meetings if they would send someone to a meeting and share what they'd been doing and see what we could learn from each other and that kind of thing.
Mm.
And basically, eventually, that or fairly quickly, that became a twice yearly gathering,
Okay.
um, and and developing resources to share and that kind of thing. And it grew quite quickly in the first few years. Um, so it was really intended as a Quaker sort of collaborative learning community
Right.
around how do we do sustainable living,
Right.
sustainability, whatever that is. And now it's become more, I think, because people, or certainly our core people, have stopped thinking we're going to save the world or we're going to
Okay.
rescue things. It's more a community that's trying to stand still in that space and ask how we are led, and be a spiritual community in that space. I think that's, well, a Quaker community in that space.
So why do you say the community is so central to the response to this then?
So I suppose from my research on consumption, I think what you actually find is that mostly people, even when people believe they are making individual choices,
Hmm.
they are mostly actually conforming to their peer group. Um,
Yeah.
and, if you look at what people have got in their shopping baskets, you find that there's research in this that it really matches very well to their cultural groups, their tribes, whatever.
Hmm.
So I was really interested in Quakers as a self-conscious, self-aware tribe, whether we as groups, because we are relatively good at saying to ourselves collectively, oh, what are we doing here? We have a practice for that. We may not always be good at it, but we have a practice for it, and it's been
Yeah.
honed over centuries,
Yeah. I can believe that. So how does that works in our benefit then, does it? That works in our favor to collectively work towards a specific goal. So how would you I mean,
I do know.
in your hopeful stage, whenever this was it 10 years ago? Was it 15 years
Well, we're
ago?
talking 25 years ago. This is when I
Okay.
when I started it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 2001-ish.
Okay. So what were your hopes then? What was the idea that you were trying to and
Well,
what
I was really hoping that we might be able to form, support local groups finding their own way with Quaker practice, essentially. Um, and I think what I found was that the people who wanted to engage were much more I would say secular in the way they were thinking. So they tended to think in terms of campaigning or in terms of having lifestyle changes that we were trying to persuade people to make, rather than how do we find our way forward together in a group and how do we support it? How do we hold an ethics that is up against the spirit of the age, that is not attuned with the spirit of the age, or which is trying to find a different way forward, which is, and I was thinking of that partly as the groups being able to somewhat hold themselves in that, hold the individuals in them against the spirit of the age. So how do we cope with the media and the consumerism and all that stuff? But I think that didn't work. And I think mostly, and I found a lot of people just getting into conflict with their meetings because they were trying to convert people to something or
Mm.
persuade people something.
And I assume what we're talking about here is things like communal living, vegetarianism, getting away, removing your car. Am I right in that? Is that the kinds of things we're talking about?
Well, I think that's a sort of, so I really don't want to say what other people
Yeah.
should do.
Right.
The truth, the scientific fact, if you like, is that if
Hmm.
you ask what is causing climate change, global warming, global heating, whatever you want to call it, um, what is it that we are doing that has the impacts?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's eating meat and dairy, it's driving, flying, it's heating our homes with fossil fuels. Those are the kind of biggies. And maybe the materials we use and all that stuff. Well, and electricity, but so those are the kind of big climate cause, causes. But I'm more interested in actually how do we cope with ourselves? How do we cope with each other in order to be able to do what works really? Because it's interesting just how hard it is for people to make what seem to me like rational choices. Why it doesn't seem rational to me that we cannot stop doing things that are very likely to lead to cataclysm. So what is it about us that how do we and then for me then sustainability means actually having a healthy relationship with ourselves,
Mm.
each other, and the world that includes actually not causing harm, monitoring that of God in the other, um, you know. So the ethics, the specific ethics, I wouldn't want to say, but I think there are Quaker ethic, there's Quaker discipline,
Mm.
which I would love it if we Quakers could learn to practice more, which is stuff like standing still in the light and letting it show us our darkness and you know bring us to new life and all that stuff. And it's interesting that. So I guess there's something about the individual and the collective openness to our own darkness, which for me the two part. One of the things that for me that was going on at the same time as I was doing equipping for ministry is I was trying to make sense of my personal darkness in having gone into my second probably Quaker divorce. So there was a bit of the shame around that, but also the yearly meeting was having big conversations about Israel, Palestine, and taking sides and stuff.
Mm.
And I was trying to make sense of my shame as a Jew and, from having a Zionist bit
Yeah,
of family and all that stuff. So there's a lot of what do we do with that, with shame
yeah,
and having been part of causing damage and so on. And but then there's also the answering that of God in the other. And I think it's really interesting. We don't ask the light to show us other people's darkness. The
no.
commitment for me is to answer that of God in the other, not to point out where they're wrong.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because you'd probably find a lot of problems with my lifestyle. And one of the things I talk about is that I eat meat, and this does not go down very well with in Quaker circles. So it's interesting that, these are and I don't feel shame around it. So I'm very glad to hear that you're not trying to find, the darkness in other people's actions, if you like. But what do you do with this? Let's use that as an example. And you mentioned earlier about holding both the individual and the collective. What
Oh,
is?
by the way, and I would say the relational as well. I mean, I think
Hmm.
Quakers, Quakerism's particular
Hmm.
gifts. I mean, I think if you like the individual practice or individual spiritual practice, there's a lot that's in Buddhism and lots of other spaces. I think the really interesting bits of Quakerism, where it has a USP, if you like,
Hmm.
is around the relational, which is, the essence of that is answering that of God in the other, I think. But taking that, for me, taking that very strongly, it's not just seeing that the other person might have a bit of good in them. It's really, if it is that of God in you, then I should be allowing myself to be transformed by it.
Hmm.
So there's that discipline. And then the collective of seeking unity. And we have a lot of practice around that, I guess.
But how does that work then for somebody like myself? So I've grown up in Wales, lots of farms around. and I literally can't imagine a country or a Britain without farms, without animal farming. I just can't imagine that. It seems, gosh, I haven't thought about that before, but it just seems, well, impossible and unlikely, but not a good thing either. It feels a very barren thing. So, and I haven't really thought it through or even tried to explain it before, but I feel that that process of supporting local farms and British farming is an important thing, and that to eat meat, lamb, beef, it is actually the right thing to do. And I just wonder how does that land, if you like, in a Quaker space? You're talking about having these individual strands, but held collectively, in quite a powerful way, and you say a relational way. How does that work? Because I feel very judged, even in a very mild way, and I don't let it bother me. It doesn't bother me, but I feel it. So, what what do you make of that?
I think it probably isn't helpful for us to focus
Oh,
entire,
okay.
get into the conversation too much. I think it's more about how do we hold it, because I think at one level, it's an intractable conflict that you have one set of needs and values, which is about sustaining a human culture, as human institutions, ways of life that people
Mm.
feel they have no alternative to. And on the other hand, you have, well, it's probably the end of the world as we know it, really. I mean, that there may well not be any people or sheep or any
Mm.
other things in I don't know how many centuries because of the way we're wrecking ecosystems and earth
So,
systems and so on.
because you see that as, and I'm sorry to, I mean, we've got to pick up something to talk about, otherwise I don't quite know what you're getting at. So, is it because you think it's an intractable problem? So it's almost not talked about then. Is that what you're saying? That we hold this space in which we each act, but are able to hear in each other what
Yeah.
they see in each other, what people's lives are like, and what people's choices are. And we allow that to be. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah. I think Thomas Penny's Swarthmore lecture was really helpful kind of ground. And I think, I mean, I know people are still doing stuff with it. I hope it'll take off more, but I feel that was really helpful in terms of, how do we get at our different truths and how can we have conversations? But, Israel Palestine, for me, that's,
Yeah.
at least there's all of these big,
Well, there
things
are.
that, um, and, that's one, I'm going to take that one because I have it in a way you're not involved. So it's easier for me to say where I am without it being personally challenging to you,
Okay.
possibly.
Okay.
But as a having grown up within, with the Zionist narrative in my ears, I think I understand pretty well where they're coming from.
Which is,
Well, essentially, Jews in Europe have um, been the enemy within for many centuries and have been, there've been pogroms and massacres and whatever. And there was many of the people who became Zionists were actually secularizing Jews who were trying to assimilate into their cultures. My grandfather didn't, I asked him once, he went to synagogue, but he said, I have no great faith, didn't have a God thing particularly going on for him. But it was a real sense. I think it partly came out of the whole European ideology of nation states.
Mm.
And, we need to be a nation state. We need to have a safe place. We need to, we're not safe in anyone else's country, so we need our own. And, this was very much what my cousins were saying to me in 1987,
Mm.
who had emigrated from the UK, was that they experienced intolerable anti-Semitism in the UK, and Israel was the only place they could really be safe. So that's how there's that mentality of a fortress,
Yeah.
probably of the current world order being temporary and needing to grab as much of it as they can while they can, you know.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not very long term thinking either, but whereas for me, I suppose I felt people were coming to get on quite relatively well with, I got called names as a child, but sorry, I'm getting too far into it, I think the thing is recognizing that that problem came out of the, it came out of Europe.
Hmm.
It's a European product. There's a bit of a tendency for people. I mean, I think there's a bit too much of a tendency for people to try and decide who's right and who's wrong, and they should do this and they should do that, without actually saying, oh, okay, this comes from us. And it's easy for me as a Jew to say, oh, this comes from me. But it's harder for you as a Brit to say, oh, this comes from me. But actually, it's deeply embedded. The source is deeply embedded in our culture. And, and more directly in the UK, not taking Jewish refugees after the war, and UK and US. So actually, they had to go somewhere. There was loads of stuff that has played into it,
Mm.
but it's like the perpetrator is often a victim that's just not been well handled.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you do with that? And I think it's for me, I would rather we didn't believe in needing national borders and that we found a way for people to coexist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the Quaker approach to these things, then, one of the things that you said just now, it is one of the things that I find niggles me. So you just said, let's talk about Israel Palestine because that's over there and it won't bother me, rather than talking about what's right here. And it's interesting you've said that as a good thing because I think of that as tricky because it
Yeah.
means it's quite easy to have opinions about what goes on over there. And one of the things that I worry about is that Quakers in Britain have these opinions about what should be happening all over the world in these various
Yeah.
places. And we
Yeah.
don't, and all the resources and the energy goes over to that place over there, which is much easier to have an opinion
Yes.
on.
No, you're quite right. And I'm really happy to talk about the meat too, if you like. I mean, no, you're quite
Well,
right.
but
And I didn't quite, I think I didn't quite get to where I end on that is actually how on earth do we get to a space where people can really hold the problem together and really get to know each other over it. And that's maybe one of the problems with us trying to talk about meat in a Zoom, in a limited amount of time, is that we
I get that.
is
Yeah.
that an awful lot of this is actually getting to know one another in the things that are eternal and really understanding what the motivations are and seeing, okay, sometimes there is a gradual internalization of the other's view and like that passage in Faith and Practice about the young friends world plenary meeting, the Ethel Livermore one, I think it was. The passage where they'd been really struggling with each other and they ended up trying to represent each other's
Oh,
theologies in the. I can't remember the. I can't do detail on it, but you know the one I mean.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I'm using this as a little microcosm of the things that go on in meeting for worship
Mm,
and groups of people and communities. Um, so I know it's putting us both on the spot right now, but I
mm.
suppose I see it as emblematic of what happens
Yeah.
is we find this quite difficult and emotionally awkward and time consuming potentially. And
Mm.
and I just feel that I don't quite understand why Quaker meetings have so many foreign concerns. Now, I know Israel-Palestine affects us all, and I know it affects people like yourself, particularly when you've got family involved in as well. But do you see my point that we don't actually seem to look at what's right in our neighborhood quite as much as perhaps we should. We look across the world instead.
So certainly, I get it's certainly difficult for me uh, that some Quakers have such strong opinions, and I think it's difficult for Jewish neighbours of Quaker meetings
Mm.
that and it's a classic Jewish complaint that people are really focused on what Israel is doing, but they're not nearly as focused on Congo or you know
Well, indeed,
um,
indeed.
um, but I'm not. But then climate, it is really interesting. I mean, if you ask, I've done membership visits,
Mm.
and or actually, I've done an awful lot of workshops with Quaker groups. If you ask people what it means to them to live their spirituality, they very often do seem to talk about climate and the kind of environmental bit. It's interesting how much that's become part of what it means to live your faith. So it's sort of there, and it's also here. But
Yeah. I mean, if we come back to the climate issue, it just made me laugh then because I thought, oh gosh, if you had a house visit from Laurie Michaelis to come and look at your house and look at all of the sustainability things that you're not doing, is that the kind of
yeah, but I'm not. I'm talking about a membership visit, so people who don't know me and who don't know what
yeah.
I do in necessarily, and
Yeah.
you
But
know,
it made me think when you said that, is that we have different ethics, don't we? And different things are at the fore. Um,
yeah,
and hospitality and caring for family and other things become ethical considerations for people as
yeah,
prioritize things like, having a small house with no vehicle. Whereas if you've got family to care for, practically speaking, people take other choices. So
absolutely.
do you feel that the Quakers in Britain balance all of these things well?
No, no, and again, I suppose for me, I'm not terribly interested in Quakers being green. I think the gift that Quakers can bring to the world on this
Hmm.
is actually in being able to be conscious of what we're doing and talk about it. Um,
That's
so
interesting.
it's
Yeah.
actually so it's actually the willingness to the ability to see ourselves and maybe find a way forward. I mean, I think at one level we do. We find a way forward. Which is imperfect, inevitably. And if the metric is how is greenhouse gas emissions or something or lifestyle, then Quakers are definitely greener than if you took another random group of people of the same age and class and
Perhaps.
whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
Perhaps. Yeah.
but if in terms of what I really care about which is actually as humans being able to function well together. I don't think we, and I'm an elder in my meeting, and we're tied up in knots over various things,
Mm.
which I probably had better not say, but but it's very. There's also a current phenomenon which I think is probably a lot of it is since the pandemic of, on the one hand, we've got some people who want to go back to when we did things properly and when, you know, stuff like doorkeepers, for instance, And on the other hand, we've got in my meeting a huge influx of new people who, we had a big influx of young adult friends actually in the pandemic. I'm not sure what exactly was going on that meant that they all came to Quakers.
Mm.
Maybe it was just we were the first place of worship to to start meeting,
Yeah, yeah.
but I mean, that's a thriving group. So there's kind of what's going on there, and it's but at the moment we don't have a clear sense of what we want to be together, and I think that's true in the early meeting. I mean, yeah, in different ways.
It's really interesting what you just said that your main concern is not to make every Quaker meeting really green or you said something like that. I'm really surprised by that.
Mm.
That is what I thought. And not just you personally, obviously, but in general. That is I think there is that thought. And more than that, I think because there is that impression given, I think we then end up with a certain type of person that is drawn to Quakers. And I think that is quite conscious. And what for me the tension there is how we say that we're looking for diversity of different types of people. And yet actually, culturally, we're really quite, I don't know if controlling is not quite the right, we try to steer culturally what we value. And as you said, you think that perhaps compared to another typical group, we might be greener. But you see what I'm trying to say? That it seems to
Well, I'm
counter.
pretty sure. I'm pretty sure we're greener. We're also more middle class. We're also more liberal. We're also more all sorts of things. Um, but I think there's also. I mean, also certainly we have more people in my meeting who have done whole house, eco retrofits than
Yes.
you could possibly find among a similar group. For instance, so people willing to put quite big amounts. People who have resources being willing to put. But then we also have a lot of. There are a lot of Quakers who live ultra frugally
Yeah.
and on very little money, and
Yeah. But
have
don't you think it
stayed.
works against that idea of diversity? All sorts of different diversity. It seems to me that it's actually aiming to be diverse, or it says it's aiming to be diverse, but I don't actually see it as a real wish, as a real plan of action or a desire to be more diverse. Because
Yeah,
everything that we do is actually quite narrow in its this is, frugality, simplicity, some kind of green ethos to how we do things.
yeah, but I don't think as I say, I'm not trying to badge Quakers as green. I'm not interested in badging Quakers as green, but it is my, if you like, my main worldly focus is on the Earth crisis,
Mm,
and I am really, I'm really interested in what Quakers can offer that,
yeah.
which as I say, I think is more to do with collective and relational consciousness than about the nuts and bolts of
Yeah.
insulation and diet.
So let's finish with that then. So, what are your hopes for the future of Quakers in Britain? Because perhaps it has something to do with that idea that you just talked about there in terms of collective consciousness.
Yeah.
Um,
Gosh, I'm not sure if um, do I have hopes of the future of, I suppose do we need to finish quite soon? Are we coming to the end? I'm just thinking about um, so I think it relates to approach to Earth crisis stuff, but it's the kind of being able to see where what we have been doing has really come to an end and really to openly ask how we're led. And I think there's probably more letting go that might be needed in that um, than than people are ready for. I'm thinking about the future British Quakerism conference. I guess that felt to me like a defensive, worried about the numbers. How do we
Yeah,
bring more people in?
yeah,
And where, and I think those kind of preoccupations feel it's a survival mentality, and it's the mentality of a dying order, I
mm,
think.
mm.
Um, but that doesn't mean Quakerism, or that there may be many Quaker threads which have a future. And I think one bit is I'm not sure whether it's one or many. And then there are a lot of people who've resigned their membership over the last few decades and gone off and done other transformational things. And maybe that's actually where Quakerism's really alive. So it's hard to,
Well,
it
yes.
doesn't necessarily. We may be the remnant that's in the dying bit, and other, you know.
Yes, I mean, I don't think that it's important that Quakers survives as a group. If that's kind of a getting at the same thing, the work will go on, and the energy will go on, if you like.
Mm.
So, in that respect, then you don't feel the need to be hopeful about the future of Quakers.
Well, again, the word hope is a really interesting one because I think, well, I suppose again, for me, I inhabit a world where people are thinking and talking a lot about Earth crisis, which is sort of all, um, and there was somebody at the Future British Quakerism conference said, they basically think humans are going to be gone in decades, and there's basically no hope for us and good riddance, more or less. Not in quite exactly those words, but close.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think there's something about, um, and of course it connects for me with being with the Zionist thing that, the sort of tribal survival thing doesn't
Yeah.
interest me.
No,
Um,
I get that. I get that. Um, and it's kind of where I'm at in a similar sense. I don't think it's important that Quakers survive. One thing you just said, though, I don't want to just let go, which is
yeah.
this person that you said, oh, that humans will be gone in a few decades. What what bothers me about that sentiment taking hold and being talked about a lot? It bothers me of what that does to young people. So it's probably another meat issue between us, really, in the sense that I worry about the impact of that on young people who are then less likely to, you know, invest in their careers and
Yeah. So,
family.
and I think that's where, so for me, where I am with that is, um, it is possible that humans will wipe ourselves out, and we're more likely to wipe ourselves out with nuclear weapons than climate change. Um,
Mm.
but I also, so sorry, part of what comes out of that world of thinking about collapse and so on is phrases like active hope and radical hope, which is not that I particularly expect anything, or It's not a particular thing that I expect to happen, but is actually being faithful and doing the stuff
Mm,
without being attached to the outcome. So
yeah.
I so and that phrase radical hope, it actually was coined, I think, around indigenous American people who were nearly wiped out in the European Nakba in America. And it's this kind of, well, if everything that currently has meaning for us is lost, what might then be worth doing? What might be the seeds that are worth leaving for the future? Or,
Mm.
what might we have? And not so much about how I'm going to be, but what's, so they're young people. It's, again, it's very important for me. And, thinking, well, actually, um, some of it for me does come back to actually those Quaker fundamentals of advice inquiry is one, if you like, and answering that of God in the other, and those really basic spiritual and relational disciplines that maybe enable us to function better in a lot of different situations if we can really practice them.
Mm. Well, I think it's a great note to end on because one of the things that I do want is to be able to is to provide hope. I mean, I do think hope is important actually. Um, and those of us in the second halves of our lives, if you like, I think we do need to pass on words of hope. So, thank you very much, Laurie. Thank you for your time today.
Okay, thank you, Emma.